A very good afternoon and welcome to a special edition of Business Live. Coming up in the next half an hour, Donald Trump unleashes a global trade war with tariffs on Canada, Mexico and China, but agrees to pause Mexico's for the next month following last-ditch talks. Global markets slump with European motor manufacturers taking the biggest hits. And over the next 30 minutes, we'll be joined by a panel of experts to answer your tariff questions and to find out what might happen next. Hello and welcome to this special edition of Business Live with me, Darren McCaffrey. And that's because there is only one big story in town today, and that is Donald Trump's tariffs on America's biggest trading partners have come as a shock to some, with global stocks tumbling amid fears of a full-blown trade war to come. So what happens next? Who might the winners and losers be? And if a trade war does escalate, how might it affect the pound in your pocket? That's what we're hoping to explain over the next 30 minutes. And you can still send in your questions, thanks to all who've done so far. Just scan that QR code on your screen and you can submit your questions via the Sky News app. Well, delighted to say, joining me this afternoon are George Lagarias. He's Chief Economist at Forvis. We've got Katie Martin, Markets Columnist at the Financial Times, and Anna MacDonald, Investment Manager at Aubrey Capital Management. We'll speak of those in a second, but a reminder of what has happened, because over the weekend, Donald Trump confirmed tariffs of 25% on neighbouring Canada. Mexico, too, faced tariffs of 25%, but in the last hour, they've been put on hold for a month, following Mexico's promise to send 10,000 troops to the border, while China faces an extra 10% on its goods being imported into the US. Well, the US president has said the tariffs on imports from Europe will definitely happen, but when it comes to us in the UK, the situation remains a little bit unclear. And let's have a look at how the markets have reacted today. The Nasdaq there is down 0.76%, but most of the indices have been clawing back some of their earlier losses. In Europe, though, as I say, a sea of reds as the European stocks, particularly dragged down by motor manufacturers who've taken the biggest hits. Here in London, the FTSE has also closed in the last couple of minutes, down over 1%. This has also allowed the dollar to do pretty well when it comes to currencies. But again, that situation has changed throughout the day, with sterling gaining back some of the grounds, particularly with that pause from Mexico, and is currently up at 124 against the dollar, and also, must be said, up against the euro at €1.20. And finally, let's have a look at how oil is doing, energy prices. It is up, Brent crude, but not quite as much as earlier as we'd seen today, up at $75.82 for a barrel of Brent crude. Well, let's kick things off with our three panellists today. And George, I'm going to start with you and just your reaction to what has happened in the last hour. Some reprieve for Mexico. And we know that President Trump is going to speak to Prime Minister Trudeau again later on this afternoon.
So we're going to see a lot of this. We're going to see tariffs imposed and then threatened and then taken back. We're going to see a lot of negotiation. You know, the question when we entered this was whether tariffs are an end game or whether tariffs are a negotiating tool. And I think by today's stance, President Trump is answering that they are indeed a negotiating tool.
A negotiating tool. And Anna, it looks like you might suggest that they're trying to strike a deal with Canada here, aren't they? But fundamentally, Canada's like, well, we haven't really got an awful lot to give, in the sense it's not quite the same as Mexico in sending troops to the border, for example.
Yes, there was actually no sort of prescribed, if you do this, then we'll reduce the tariffs. So presumably when Mexico arranged to send 10,000 troops to the border, that was something that they could negotiate with. But the problem is it's only around 1% of fentanyl and illegal immigration that is happening over that northern border with Canada. So it is much less clear what they need to do.
You know what? Let's get on with the questions now, because a lot of them have come in, and we're going to start, and you kind of posed it yourself, George, there, which is, what do we think Trump's endgame is? I'm going to put this actually first to George. You said we've got a sign of what that is today, and it's purely transactional.
Yes, look, his end game is to improve the competitive position of the United States and reverse the country's competitive decline. Okay, the question is he pulling the right levers to achieve this over the longer term, and what the repercussions will be for the other nations? But this is a very long 3D chess game. It's interesting. A study in 2011 suggested that for every dollar spent on an item labeled made in China, 55 cents went towards services produced in the United States. So you impose tariffs here and you hurt services back in the US. It is a very complex game, and blanket tariffs make it all the more complex. So it's not a question of intentions, but rather the levers.
Indeed. And people are questioning the motives here, aren't they, Katie, from the FT? We've got a question from Curious Phil, who's asking, why does Trump think tariffs are taxes on foreign countries when it's the American public and businesses that will ultimately pay for them?
Well, I mean, Curious Phil is Curious Katie as well. I mean, it's not clear that how the president thinks that tariffs actually work, what he thinks the direct impact of them are. And that's one of the things that makes this such a difficult situation for foreign governments and businesses and investors to deal with. It's very difficult to pin down Donald Trump's motivations and what he's actually seeking to achieve here. So, as you say, the tariffs that were announced over the weekend relating to Mexico and to Canada in particular were quite a big shock. He has said that more tariffs are coming against Europe, which he has said the way they've been behaving is an atrocity. It's kind of difficult to understand what he means there. Europe has been selling goods to the US that the US wants to buy. It's hard to see how that shapes up to be an atrocity. And then, as you say, there was this delay that came in quite late with Mexico. So that just all adds up to a situation that's very, very difficult to read. One thing that really strikes me from what we've seen today is that, as you've explained, stock markets around the world did respond to what we saw announced over the weekend, but it wasn't that big of a hit. And to me, that means that he will read this as something of a success. It's the stock market saying, well, we're not going to really fall out of bed if you do bring in even quite draconian tariffs, even against countries that are friends and neighbors. So we do find ourselves at quite a delicate juncture.
That's interesting, isn't it, Anna, in the sense that George and Katie seem to be suggesting here this is merely part of the patter that we're going to see now from Donald Trump in the years to come, you know, suggesting he's going to impose tariffs to strengthen his negotiation position and then maybe at the last moment pull back. We've seen that with both Colombia and Mexico, even within the last week. But is that sustainable? Because then don't you become maybe the boy that calls wolf, if you like?
The cries wolf, yes, absolutely. I mean, it does start to lose its power, but you can imagine Trump then doubling down, can't you? And just moving to yet another surprising standpoint. So I think that it's just murky water, as Katie said, for investors and for politicians to see their way through. I suppose the way that we look at it is try and work out those services and those companies that are less affected, and try and look at those underlying companies. But it is going to be a really muddied picture.
It is. Let's talk about the markets, though, George, if we can, because I think, as Katie was suggesting there, we've not seen. You know, we saw stocks down today, but it wasn't like Nvidia and others last Monday in terms of the scale of stocks collapsing. So, as Craig asks here, you know, what are the chances of a financial collapse of a bank at the same level as Goldman Sachs and Northern Rock happening? I.e., how bad could this get in terms of our financial institutions? That's what Craig wants to know.
Very well shored up. They're not as leveraged as they were before the global financial crisis. So, you know, things would have to get considerably worse, even from the worst case scenarios as we're looking at them right now, for such a crisis to reoccur. I'm not saying it is impossible, but we're definitely not on that road.
Judge, just on that point, though, about where we're at, it is interesting that he's imposed 25% on Mexico and Canada. 25% of Mexico's being paused for the moment. Only 10% on China. What do we think that is? Because I thought China was meant to be the nemesis here.
Well, first of all, maybe he won't. I think he's due to visit China, so maybe he wants to have a talk with them first, see what he can extract. Second, the previous tariffs excluded goods under $800. So now these tariffs include those goods, which actually make it a lot more impactful. But that doesn't matter to China so much because they export their goods to Vietnam, and from Vietnam they're exported back to the US. That's why the Vietnam has a very big trade surplus with the US. So if he really wants to target China, he's going to target Vietnam. And he hasn't done so, which means he's waiting for something.
OK, well, we will wait as well. Katie, we've got MLR here asking, will tariffs cause fluctuations in exchange rates? I think we can suggest the answer to that is yes. Will this benefit Brits travelling to the US, for example?
So one thing that goes hand in hand with tariffs is that you get a stronger dollar. So we saw the dollar push higher against all sorts of different currencies today, including sterling and the euro. But it wasn't a huge move. But the general feeling is that when you impose tariffs, that raises costs for consumers in the US and it pushes up inflation. Now, whether that's a one-off shock to the price level or whether it's quite an enduring trend of higher inflation, we don't actually know yet because we haven't really run this natural experiment before quite like this. But all things being equal, it is expected to be supportive for the dollar. So on that basis, you get a weaker pound. And so actually, if you're traveling to America, I'm afraid you're not going to be able to buy more with your money. But the thing that matters here is the level of volatility. So if you're running a business where you sell goods to America, for example, or you run a business that depends on goods that are traded in dollars, then you do have that extra layer of volatility and uncertainty around what kind of money you've got going to have coming in and going out. That's quite unhelpful to businesses. And the other point around these tariffs, as you say, with Mexico, they got brought in and then apparently delayed for a month after some negotiations with Claudia Sheinbaum, who's the president of Mexico. But just the fact that you make these threats actually is in itself quite problematic, whether you follow through with the tariffs or not, because it really undermines the ability of trading partners to feel like you're an honest broker, you're having straightforward negotiations on trade in future. So it does complicate negotiations looking forward. But also, it makes it a little bit difficult for companies and for consumers to maintain the levels of confidence that we've seen coming out of the election. So there were very high levels of investor enthusiasm and small business enthusiasm coming out of the US election. This chips away at that.
Let's go on to what Matt T is asking, Anna, saying that with other currencies crashing against the US dollar, would this be a good time to invest in foreign currencies to trade in once they've inevitably rise again? Again, kind of trying to play the currency market, if you like, a little.
I wouldn't advise trying to play the currency market as an individual investor. I think that would be pretty difficult. We've seen a lot of volatility in the currency markets, but as Katie said, it's actually been not that huge moves. So it's I would think by the time you were trying to do that, it's probably a bit of a fool's errand.
OK, and just finally, George, before we go to the break, on just kind of what Katie was suggesting there about the kind of insecurity and America's position not necessarily being a good actor in all of this, but isn't it just a reminder that this was Donald Trump elected to do America first, and that's just what he's going to do?
Well, I'm surprised that sometimes that people are surprised that he's actually following through, because he has been honest with this, and and that's the strategy. So that's definitely the road forward, and we should expect to see a lot more of that. Now, whether other countries think they're an honest broker, that's the longer-term question, right? Will other countries band together and trade more with themselves as the American consumer sort of becomes a little bit more isolated, or will they try to find ways to move forward? Some will go one way and some will go the other way. It will not be a clear picture.
OK, right, we're going to pause there for the time being, guys. George, Katie, Anna, stay where you are. Do get in touch if you've still got questions at home. We'll take a quick break. Coming up next on Business Live, more of those questions, particularly looking at what the impact could be on us here in the UK. Is the UK still special in the special relationship? Join us in just a couple of minutes.
I'm Dominic Waghorn, Sky's International Affairs Editor, covering a world that seems to be unravelling. War, unrest, revolutions.
It's not his country, it's ours.
They have succeeded for the first time in their country's history in removing a leader from power.
No freedom! Sky News, the full story first.
There was fighting here, but there's clearly now a lull, and they're using it to bring up more ammunition.
This is a mass exodus in which Russia is hemorrhaging some of its brightest and its best. According to the local weather channel, there have been more than 2,500 lightning strikes and flash flooding, all on top of this week's lethal tornado. What stays with you most in this job is some of the people you meet. What is your worst fear about what the Russians want to do to the children?
They're just boosting demographics by stealing young people.
Would you like to take the opportunity, Mr. President, on Sky News to invite Barack Obama to come here? Mr. Trump, are you running for president? Can you confirm it?
We're going to take a look, a very serious look.
On that day, we saw your fighters killing women, killing children. Was that a mistake? Did you go too far? You couldn't control your fighters? The full force of the state is being used to crush any protest. Free wherever you get your news. It's half an hour now past the deadline that Hamas issued, and we've now seen a third barrage of rockets coming in.
Another alarm. The mood here is jittery and nervous.
We're seeing the world get more and more divided, and it's our job to try to make sense of it all.
Weeknights on Sky News.
This is your chance. Tell people. Welcome to the Politics Hub.
Our police force has apologised. If you want to find out about Grimsby, you come to the docks.
I'm live in Jerusalem.
Are you not concerned that that could lead to all-out war?
Hello there, good evening. There are fears of an upsurge in violence. What's at stake here?
You are watching the press preview, a first look at the front pages as they arrive.
Mandatory evacuation, you must leave!
For many people, Harvey is far from over.
People here believe the water will be this deep for weeks.
I'm Greg Milam, and I'm Sky's Chief North of England correspondent.
Are you trying to run me over, Sir Philip?
No, go away.
Look like it, sir. Will you respond to those who made accusations, Sir Philip?
Can you go away?
Sky News, the full story first.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story.
I'm ready. Are you?
Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Fly Emirates, fly better. Fly Emirates, fly better.
Very welcome back. You're watching a special edition of Business Live where we're answering your questions on Donald Trump's trade tariffs. Well, delighted to say we're still joined by our three experts this afternoon. That's George Lagarias, Chief Economist at Forvis Mazars, Katie Martin, the markets columnist at the Financial Times, and Anna MacDonald, investment manager at Aubrey Capital Management. Katie, let's go to you. Tom Finney's been in touch saying, what goods and services does the UK trade directly with the US, i.e., you know, what does our deficit look like when it comes to trade with the United States?
Well, the good news is that we don't run a huge imbalance, actually, with the US in terms of goods. Now, does that get us absolutely out of hot water? Not necessarily, because as we were saying earlier, it is quite difficult to understand what Trump's motivations are sometimes. So we could still find ourselves snarled up in something that we can't really control. Our primary export, really, if you like, to the US is much more dominated by services, which are much more difficult to put tariffs on. So we should be insulated to that extent. If we did find ourselves in a situation where Trump were to want to impose tariffs on the UK, then he might choose some kind of goods that are kind of quite emblematic of UK consumer products. So, for example, Scotch or cashmere. But overall, it is difficult to see us getting snarled up in this. Now, it wouldn't be helpful to have tariffs imposed on British goods, no matter, you know, how big of a part of the UK economy they are. So it is definitely worthwhile trying to stay off Trump's radar, if you like. But we shouldn't be in as much danger as the EU, which Trump has been very clear he wants to impose tariffs there.
And that leads, George, on to Eleanor's question this afternoon, which is, should the UK stand firm with the EU against Euro tariffs, or should we side with the US in the hope of getting a special deal? What do you think?
Well, I don't see any evidence to suggest a special deal or any sort of special treatment to begin with. And generally, you know, government should be very careful not to think in retaliatory terms. They need to approach the problem more cannily. Just as Mr. Trump doesn't want his adversaries to know his card, then it would be unwise for the UK government to open its cards too early and wait until the very last possible moment to make decisions as to who they should side with.
Anna, what do you think of that? Because we know it was just asked in the press conference. I don't know if you saw that with Keir Starmer in Brussels. You know, in many ways, this is a political decision, but others would say, well, maybe actually it's a bit of a benefit of Brexit that we're not going to get lumped into the EU if he takes a pretty tough line against the European Union.
Yeah, I think Keir Starmer has a bit of a balancing act to make, so as not to cause too many problems together with the EU. He does want to form a better trading relationship with. The EU is our biggest trading partner. But we do know that Trump is pro-Brexit, and that he may look more kindly upon the UK. And as we've already specified, with the high proportion of services that we sell to the US, it is actually harder to see how he would put tariffs on us. And as someone in Scotland, I would hope that neither cashmere nor whiskey or Scotch would be in his firing line. And I think that Trump is quite keen on Scotland too.
Indeed, or some fine Scottish salmon. Just very finally, actually, to all three of you, question from Carl G. Well, George, we'll start with you. Got about 30 seconds each because we are running out of time. Lots of people will be watching this programme saying, why don't we hit back? Why don't we hit back? Carl G is saying, what tariffs could other nations impose on the US that will have an immediate effect on the entire US economy?
Again, I think people should not think in retaliatory terms. I think this is a long-term strategic game, and all sides should approach it to maximize benefit or minimize loss. So it's not a quid pro quo, I hit you, you hit me kind of thing.
Katie?
If you come from the starting point that trade tariffs are silly and damaging, then it is quite difficult to justify retaliating with more tariffs. At the same time, in the situation of Canada, for example, it's kind of the only tool that they've got. So there are arguments both ways. But as George says, it's probably best not to accelerate things too much.
OK, and finally, Anna?
I think Trump just wants to leverage the power of America. And unfortunately, they are more powerful in an economic and a military standpoint. So they will have the asymmetric advantage here.
OK, really fascinating stuff. We'll have to see how this all plays out. As I say, on Mexico this afternoon, it's been paused for a month. We know that President Trump is due to hold a second phone call with Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, a little later on. George, Katie, Anna, really appreciate your time this afternoon. It is a fascinating discussion, and it is one I feel like we're going to have to get very used to over the next 4 years with President Trump in the White House. Thank you very much indeed. George Lagarias there, Katie Martin and Anna MacDonald. Thank you. OK, well, that is it for me on Business Live for this afternoon. We're back, of course, at 11:30 tomorrow morning. Up next, it is the News Hour with Mark Austin with more on that developing story this afternoon about the pause, essentially, that President Trump has put on those tariffs for Mexico. Could it be extended to Canada? Stay tuned for that. But I'll see you tomorrow morning, 11:30. Thanks for joining. Thanks for sending in your questions. And a very goodbye.